And I'm just going to begin by laying out what I think is the sort of crucial background for the work that Young Lives does. I would like to argue that childhood is the most critical phase in life, and indeed the first 1,000 days of a child's life, that is from conception onwards, are absolutely key. So the quality of care, the nutrition and stimulation that a child receives from those very early stages are absolutely vital for later development down the line. And I think it's very good news that we now find that, as never before, attention is being paid across the world to children, including very young children, both to their current well-being and also to securing their future as healthy and productive adults. And I just want to touch on the reason behind this, because I think it's really what provides the backdrop for all of our work. First of all, it's very important for countries, governments, families, communities, and everybody to recognize that there is a really direct link between the development of a whole nation and the development of its children. They're mutually reinforcing, so that economic growth and economic performance of a nation and the services that a nation provides is absolutely vital for children to grow up in healthy and good conditions and circumstances. But at the same time, the condition of children, the status of those children, is vital for the status of the nation as they grow into productive adults. So the two are extremely closely linked. I think it's also important to emphasize that we are now in a point in the demographic stage in many countries in the world where we can reap a demographic dividend. In other words, we have a larger than ever youth cohort in many countries. That is both a cost, of course, but it's also an enormous potential for national development. And so taking advantage of those large youthful populations is one of the most important things that governments can currently do. However, the challenges are absolutely enormous, and this is where the work of projects like Young Lives comes in. It has been estimated that at least 200 million children in low and middle income countries fail to achieve their developmental potential. And poverty is, of course, one of the single greatest threats to those children. It includes exposure not just to biological but also psychosocial risks. Some of you may be familiar with the recent series of publications, articles that have come out of the Lancet Journal, the prestigious Lancet Journal, and here they've identified and calculated this enormous loss of potential, and they've identified some of the risks that are now already very well known. Stunting, child stunting, which is a sign of very poor nutrition, particularly in the first stages of life, inadequate cognitive stimulation, iodine deficiency, and iron deficiency anemia are amongst the 4 most prevalent, most common, and biggest threats to children throughout the world, and in particular in low-income countries and developing countries where in low-income communities. The important point, though, is that still many of the risks that children face in many countries are not actually very well known, and they're not actually very well researched. So some are clear and understood and others aren't. So there's still an awful lot more work to be done to identify the risks. The important point also is that risks seldom happen in isolation. They generally occur together. So, for example, in many communities, children don't just face poverty, they also face social conflict and social stigma and so on. And it's the co-occurrence of risks that has cumulative effect and the potential to overwhelm developing children. So I just wanted to have sight of what we think the really big challenge is before I then move into discussing a little bit about the work of Young Lives. The study is interdisciplinary, and we include nutritionists, we include economists, anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, educationalists. We have a very large community of people from very different disciplines and perspectives. And the aim of the study is to improve understanding of the determinants and outcomes of childhood poverty, but also, and very importantly, to provide evidence to improve policies and practice. And that really is our main reason for existence. So this is not an abstract research program. It is very much a program that aims to make a difference and to improve children's lives. We work by following around 12,000 children in 4 countries. Those 4 countries are Ethiopia, and in India, where we're present in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, Peru and Vietnam. And we're working over a period of 15 years. We're working with those children over 15 years. Now we have 2 age groups in the study, 2,000 children in each country who were born around 2000, 2001, and 1,000 children in each country who were born around about 1994 to 95. This is actually really important because it means we're not just studying changes in societies, changing lives of the individual children, but also changes that occur between the 2 groups of children. So what happened at one point for the older group, and then at the same age, what happens to the younger group. So we're able to track whether things are actually getting better or getting worse over time. The sample is pro-poor, so we don't include the richest children in any of the countries. We're in approximately 80 sites in across the 4 countries. And the idea behind the selection of sites is to reflect the diversity of each of those countries in terms of rural, urban communities, in terms of ethnic, language and socioeconomic groups. And also we have roughly equal numbers of boys and girls in the sample. We did our first survey round in 2002, and we are now, of course, here today to launch the findings from the 4th survey round. There will be 5 survey rounds in total, and there will also be 4 waves of qualitative research. So it's mixed methods. The qualitative research often enables us to get into depth in terms of understanding the stories behind the numbers that emerge in the survey. In India, our key partners are the Centre for Economic and Social Sciences in Hyderabad, the Women's University in Tirupati. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce, I'm just not going to go there, and Save the Children India. And we have 13 partners overall in the 4 study countries. So it's very much a partnership study. The basic conceptualization of young lives involves 3 main narratives. Life course narrative, which is absolutely key, of course, because we're a longitudinal study and we're looking at children's lives across their childhood. This involves looking at what shapes children's development and well-being and what matters most for children at which ages. And of course, what matters most for which children, because what matters for boys isn't necessarily what matters for girls in the same way. Because we're not just looking at very poor children, but we're looking at children who are slightly less poor, we have a distribution within the sample, we also pick up inequality, and that's a very important issue for us. And we're looking at the disparities between these different children, whether it be by their social status, by their locality, by their religion, by their caste. We're looking at the disparities both socioeconomic and also in terms of exposure to risk, because we see significant differences. We're also looking at the changing influences in children's lives. And this has been a really dramatic period, this decade, this first decade of the 21st century. I really want to emphasize that. So much has changed in this short period of time in all 4 of these countries. And we're trying to understand, we're not making the assumption that all these changes are for the good. We're looking at the extent to which new risks, for example, might be emerging. We're looking at how household circumstances are changing over time. Access to services, access to infrastructure, information and communications technology, and so on. And what does this mean for the experiences of children? we have certain topics within these overall narratives that we're focusing on in particular. It's a very large survey. We have to be very thoughtful about the amount of time we spend talking to respondents in the field. So we've been forced to make certain choices, certain selections. So school effectiveness and learning is an absolutely crucial one for us. This is looking at enrollment, learning levels, progression through school, retention, and relevance of education. We have information on health and nutrition, including stunting, food security, access to water and sanitation, and so on. And also increasingly now, because of the age of our children, we're concerning ourselves with the transition, not just through childhood, but out of childhood into youth and into early adulthood. So we're beginning to look at marriage and fertility, the transition to and aspirations for employment, and also higher education. So we're able to see now how our children are faring in terms of their first forays, if you like, into adulthood. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a very brief touch of some of the big trends, the big overview trends that we're finding in the study. And I think that the point has already been made, actually, by the professor, that growth is at the heart of this decade, of the first decade of the 21st century, not just in India, but actually across all 4 of our study countries. And I don't think when the Young Lives was set up, it was imagined that would be such consistent growth in all 4 of these countries. And that includes Ethiopia, which is by far the poorest country in the study. And so this is really the backdrop against which all our findings really need to be assessed. I think an important correlate of that growth has been we've seen consistent infrastructural improvements and increased service access. We've seen a lowering of poverty levels across the sample in a general sense, and an improvement in access to services and so on. And I think this is probably very much associated with the push from the Millennium Development Goals, which really have impacted the way governments are planning and for and thinking about children in important ways. And just to give you a few examples, there are many, many examples I could have cited here, but in Peru, for example, access to safe water increased by 50% between 2002 and 2009 in our sample. That's a pretty dramatic rise. We now see internet access in Vietnam is pervasive. It doesn't mean that everybody has internet in their homes, but via internet cafes and so on, children are accessing internet on a daily basis. Out of interest, this is also perceived by parents to be one of the new risks of childhood. Parents are very fearful in Vietnam about the loss of control, the introduction of new values, and indeed they talk about children stealing money in order to be able to pay the fees at the internet cafes and skiving off school in order to go to the internet. So this is an example of how modernity, the rise of modern ways of life, is not always seen to be positive and beneficial. And in Ethiopia, which again, as I said, started out as by far the least communicating, the least infrastructurally the least developed of our countries, dramatic external investment in Ethiopia and rise in road and communications infrastructure across both rural and urban areas, which is making an enormous difference to how children's lives are being led. And of course, very, very fundamentally, perhaps the single most important trend that we've noted in the study across, in a very general sense across this period, is the rise of schooling. And primary school enrollment, at least when the children were at that age, was nearly universal across the sample in 3 of our countries and is rapidly increasing to that level in Ethiopia. I don't think we imagined that that would be the case when we started this study out. So one of the things that we have also found associated with these changes is, if you like, an extraordinary rise in aspirations, in particular educational aspirations for children, amongst everybody. And when I say everybody, I don't just mean educated parents or children who are in school, but I also mean parents who've never had any education, and children who are outside school. School is the marker of success in childhood for practically all the children in our study. And just here to give you some examples of things that the children themselves have said to you. This is Marta, who's 15 years of age in Peru, and she says, we're not going to suffer like this in the mud. Her family is a farming family, and she says, it's better that I go and study. She has very high aspirations to be a nurse. And then there's a Fatima, who's also 15 from Ethiopia, who says, if one can learn and study hard, they will always have a good job at the end of it that can change their family's life. And I really want to stress this point. These children are taking responsibility, not just to improve their lives, but to improve the lives of their whole families. This is about a family's aspiration. So increasingly we now see children are perceived as the vehicle through which family will achieve social mobility. And here, Harika, in rural Telangana, you get better jobs if you study, and you have a better life and can marry an educated husband. So the aspiration to do better across all aspects of life, not just in terms of getting a good job, but also marrying well. And I've just thrown in this little statistic here from India about private schooling. Now, I'm not going to get into the argument about the quality or value of private versus public schooling here, but just to say that our older cohort, at the age of 8, 24% of the children in 2001 were in private school. Now that figure had doubled for the younger cohort when they were the same age in 2009. We are talking about a pro-poor sample. So even amongst the poorest of the poor in India, children are going, and particularly boys I should add, are going to private schools in the hope that this will get them better jobs at the end of the day. So these aspirations are filtering down into all levels. However, so you have high aspirations, you have growth, but then what is the sort of condition, if you like, of children in those contexts? And I would argue that there are two really serious problems that we confront. First of all, what are the foundations? I've already said that things need to start well in order to continue going well for children. And we find undernutrition in the form of stunting remains really high across all 4 countries, and it's really quite shocking. And of course, we know that early undernutrition is associated with a range of negative outcomes in learning, school progression, and indeed we have an association in the study with psychosocial, emotional outcomes as well. So right now, as of the most recent findings, for the 12-year-olds, we have in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana 30% rate of stunting still at the age of 12, and this ranges from that to 20% in Vietnam. So across all of the countries this is a really serious problem, and of course it's the poorest children who are the most affected, and in all countries the poorest third of the children are typically twice as likely to be stunted as the least poor third. We'll hear a little bit more about this later, but I just really want to home in on that one single indicator, which is a very powerful alarm bell, if you like, for the status of children in these countries. We know that early childhood care and education interventions are vital to build strong foundations for children's development. And this isn't, though, just about ECD or ECCE services like ICDS, which we have extensively in India. It's also about looking across the board at water, sanitation, food security, health. So it's an integrated approach that's needed for dealing with the problems of the youngest children. And of course, we need to be thinking very clearly about social protection and the role of social protection measures in supporting households with young children. Now, one of the very important things, it was mentioned that longitudinal research can do so much more than studies at one point in time. One of the very important things that Young Lives is finding is that some children are actually able to catch up with their peers. Some of the children who are stunted in very early childhood are catching up. And they're not only catching up physically, but they're also catching up in their schooling as well. And this is absolutely crucial because it introduces the possibility of some kind of remedial interventions. So one of the things we're trying to understand now is which children are able to catch up. What are their characteristics? What are the characteristics of their households? At what point are they catching up in their lives? And what difference can we therefore make in terms of interventions? When would we ideally want to intervene in middle childhood? And the second major problem that I want to highlight is the problem of opportunities. So yes, we have higher GDP per capita in Peru, Vietnam and India, but this has not removed the multiple deprivations experienced by rural children in particular, by ethno-linguistically minority children, religious minority children, and those whose mothers have low or no education. Now this is already, some of this is already well understood and established from other research in other studies, particularly this link to maternal education. We're not arguing that it's the mother's education in and of itself necessarily, or the lack of, but we see this as a proxy for a whole series of possibility of problems in children's lives. So one of the things we're trying to do next is understand what is it that mothers' lack of education really is an example of. Is it, for example, that mothers are not empowered, that they don't actually have the say that they need to have over their children's welfare and the decisions that need to be made for their children? So that's one of the important next steps that we want to take. So just to give you an example then of how these inequalities play out later down the line. So I was actually quite surprised from the round 4 findings that we discover that half of the older cohort children in Vietnam, Peru and India report being in educational training at age 19. That strikes me as actually quite a quite high level. But then if you get behind those findings, you begin to see that young men are a third more likely than young women to be enrolled at this age, and that young people in urban areas are twice as likely as those in rural areas. So those same disparities and disadvantages that start in early life are still playing themselves out at this later stage in life. I think the other thing that's absolutely key to all of this is these families and these children are keeping faith with education because they still have incredibly high aspirations. But the point is, so even if retention is high, progression through school is still absolutely key. And progression through school, what they actually get from schooling, is of course vital to the skill development that's necessary for their productive life as adults. And just to give you one really shocking statistic from the study, only 1 in 5 of the Ethiopia older cohort children had completed primary level at school by the age of 15, although 90% were still enrolled. So 90% of children, that is keeping faith with a system that is absolutely failing those children. I think the other final point to make on this is that nowadays, growth isn't about jobs, and it's not necessarily about good quality jobs. So are the opportunities even going to be out there for this cohort of children when they progress into the labour market? So I just want to make a few final remarks and some few final reflections. I would argue that there's no better or more efficient societal investment to make than securing strong child development from those very early days of life. I would also argue that addressing child poverty is key for wider poverty reduction and for economic growth more generally. This means integrated measures. And actually, we're all very bad at integrated measures. We all talk about it, but I'm constantly aware of how the health sector doesn't speak to the education sector doesn't speak to the social services, and the finance ministries often have all the power anyway, and they don't necessarily value some of the things that we really care about. So we need all of this to be well integrated and to be working together because we know that children's nutrition impacts their learning. So their learning needs to be supported by good nutrition. But we also need to go beyond that, and we need to think more about social protection, not just for households with young children, but particularly for the poorest households, in the poorest communities, in the poorest areas with young children. And I think it's also very important. I notice that there is much more attention, as I said, to children than there was historically in the past. But a lot of this is framed in terms of human capital. And human capital makes a great argument if you're trying to convince the finance ministry that it's in their interest to invest in children, because they want to see a more effective economy, they want to see more exports and so on. But we want to argue that attention to equity and social justice is absolutely key. It's not just about human capital formation. Some children with very severe disabilities, for example, may never be able to produce as adults at the kind of level that the human capital argument is asking. But these children have the right to be invested in as much as, if not more than, other children. So we want to be keeping the eye on the equity issue as much as anything. I think we also need to be far more aware and perhaps far more humble about the incredible sacrifices that children and their families are trying to make in terms of meeting their aspirations. I often hear people say parents are exploiting their children by putting them out to work. Parents are not exploiting their children by putting them out to work. Parents don't have any alternatives. Parents put their children out to work, indeed, including, amongst other things, to help those children get to school. So children are working in order to pay for their school, because even when it's free, it's not really free, because they still have to pay for transport, uniforms, and everything else. So there are enormous sacrifices serving these aspirations. But what are the returns? What are the returns that we are offering with these incredibly limited opportunities, particularly for these poorest and most marginalised children? So what about youth employment? What are our policies? What policies do we have in place for youth employment? Thank you.